I definitely do not work and do have anything to do with Trend Micro, just FYI. so, so just like really, so the topic of the presentation we chose to go with kind of inside cybercrime groups that harvest Active Directory for fun and profit. So really quick introduction about myself. Who am I? So my name is Vitali Kremez. It's also my Twitter handle. I do lots of like malware research and some analysis. I used to work for some like government companies in the US, government entities in the US, and private companies as well. So I've been doing it for quite some time, and one of my interests was in this research to identify how sophisticated groups essentially target huge corporations and networks. What's the latest tactic, techniques, and procedures and methods they use? And here it's also was inspired by the group we call TrickBot. If you might be familiar with TrickBot, it's one of the most prolific groups we've been tracking on the financial crime landscape. So I'm going to start. So the talk outline we'll cover through this whole entire presentation. We'll talk who these cybercrime groups is we track. I more refer to them as cybercrime enterprises because so sophisticated and how persistent they are. We'll talk more about how TrickBot in the cloud. We'll talk more one of the like largest breach cases we've been tracking in the US. I'm also live in the US, and so we have a company called Cloud Jumper, if you might be familiar. It's not really the dragon from the movie, but it's a company that actually manages cloud infrastructure and domains for other companies. So we'll cover that. We'll talk more also on what the most common Active Directory enumeration exploitation techniques. We'll live through then we're going to go and live through the life cycle of one of the major events and how actually the attacks work from the inside and from attacker side, because that's one of the most interesting TTPs we've been tracking. We'll cover also detection, mitigations, and we're going to talk more about also the key takeaways, of course, and I'll mention some of the defensive mechanisms we can use both from the defensive side and attacker side to exploit Active Directory for fun and profit. So really, I want to just dive deeper into what's the current state of cybercrime enterprise, or I would say, what's the current state of that, in 21st century. Long before ago, there was a malware called Zeus banking malware that's dived into the space of malware as a service. Since then, there's like very sophisticated groups emerged. One of them is called Dire. One is also TrickBot and Dridex. And they are more of a like cybercrime enterprises. And they all like hold a division of labor. They have different people do specific roles for them. They also employ additional botnet operators. I actually highly recommend, I did a keynote before for B-Sides in Charleston, actually talking more about the evolution of criminal intent and what's going on from the intelligence side. Kind of my also background before, I used to do lots of intelligence work for both private and government entities, looking into those groups. So what's an interesting thing we've seen is these groups are like dealing with lots of big data problems, like with all of us are. So they don't really care more about like your average installs and infections. They care more about high value targets. We call it HVT. So the targets with the corporate domains, sophisticated bank network environments, and additional infrastructure. Because of the way they do that, they need like really good parsing mechanisms or like identifying mechanisms to identify those high value installs. And they also kind of rely on some additional malware groups, like for example, Emotet, if you might be familiar, one of the most active loader as a service that sells installs to other groups. So they're capable to load additional malware. So they have robust and huge network of people who help them. So what they're looking for, like I mentioned here, is like the solutions to identify. And the idea is pretty simple. How can you monetize all of those infections? How can you squeeze the last euro dollar from your bots, right? And so they try to apply different approaches. One of them is, of course, banking malware. So it's a classical man-in-the-middle attack where you log into the website and you just can be either redirected or web injected to steal credentials, or credential stealer. They also dive into miner. So XMR, Monero miner was also used by them. And now it's ransomware. The ransomware is like one of the most interesting things because they've been very, very successful. It's very smart because once they are inside the huge corporate networks, they can not only steal all credentials, but also deploy ransomware and ask for a lot of money. Up to this date, I'll cover more that the groups actually asked one of the victims $5 billion in the US. So you'll see that more. So it's pretty simple. And how do they, what the solution was for them? How would they identify what's the most interesting bots? Imagine this if you're running a botnet, you want to know what's important, what's not. So And they were thinking about this, and what we realized also from the Windows and Microsoft instrumentations and the way we manage infrastructure, it's critical that we rely on Active Directory. I think, if you're a network admin or you automate tasks, you push patches, updates through that systems. And criminals realize that too. They realize that that will be a great idea just to start looking for that. And this is kind of like the evolution of the TrickBot or the groups behind it. It's a mix of both automation, when the people essentially use automated malware like Emotet, TrickBot, but they also use some human network exploitation actors, I'll call them. So like, for example, when they identify, this is a typical chain actually, and this is kind of Ryuk ransomware, if you're familiar with. Ryuk is also a character from, I guess, cartoon, Death Note. So they also borrowed the name from that. And so this is a chain. They use Emotet as a loader for TrickBot installs, which is a banking malware but on steroids, but also then Ryuk ransomware. And the way they do the whole chain through PowerShell Empire, post the traffic, and we'll dive deeper into that. But this is the current most successful models we've seen exploiting and targeting huge corporations, banking environments, counties, and governments in the US and all over the world. So the solution to that problem that they've been dealing with for so long, how do you identify, squeeze more value from bots and just be successful? You just look for network and Active Directory. So you identify machines that have domain controller, exfiltrate the data from the domain controller, identify what's the domains in the forest and trees. I'll dive deeper into the high level, what's the LDAP protocol, lightweight directory protocol works, and what's the Active Directory. But this is primarily what they realized. So network allows them to identify once they're inside the big network and get 20 domains, and because this will be the interesting infections for them to exploit further. And they would sell it or give it to some additional groups to monetize them. Very clever, actually, and that enables them to be very successful. So, and just like, just what's the scope of the problem like we're talking about? And just, it's just kind of some maps as I've been tracking. This is pretty much very accurate representation of some of the latest TrickBot installs. I'm not talking about the spam levels, because spam levels are exceeding that. But you can see there's an actual infection. So a certain day, they might have between 500 to 5,000 infections per day. They also spam themselves, so they use their own like spam mailer, but they also rely on additional groups like Emotet to install it essentially. And those are kind of like some of the trends I've been tracking on the malware side. Another interesting thing is that now in the days of like anti-spam things, it's really important to find a good spammer. So they're definitely pursuing that track, and that's why they use Emotet, for example, as a loader for that. So the problem is pretty huge. They definitely see between a lot of infections, and some of the most protected companies in the world with all the EDR, with all the latest antivirus solutions, they've been hit by TrickBot and they've been pretty much compromised. Many of those. So going next to next slide. So this is kind of like to give you another like connect to the real world scenario. So there was a big case recently I've been tracking, just share some of the public information that's available. So Ryuk ransomware, it's in the news. They hit the cloud MSP, managed service provider, called Cloud Jumper, essentially. And that's kind of like the problems we've been seeing. As we go into cloud, we think the cloud are protected, secured, and managed by somebody else, but what are they getting compromised? They're essentially the gates to other victim environments and managed like systems. So that's what that's what the issue is. And of course, with the news of like WePro breach and other things, we think about the third-party risk. What if they are infected, right? So, and TrickBot is very good, and the group behind it, at monetizing that aspect. So getting to third-party, pivoting back from that environment to additional ones. And we'll dive deeper into the Cloud Jumper case. Another interesting thing here was that that there was of course, maybe heard of the Los Angeles Times. And many more publishers was infected by group Ryuk. Initially, there was media speculation that might be North Korea involved because they thought they found some code overlap with Hermes ransomware. Obviously, no. It's just a TrickBot group that got inside. So, and there was a major actually blowback. Like the newspapers didn't really go live because all the cloud infrastructure was really locked or encrypted. And they're asking for a ridiculous number of Bitcoins and US dollars. So over 600,000 Bitcoins. So it's a very huge case. It highlights that how TrickBot gets into the cloud, I guess. And we'll talk more what's the initial attack vector on that specific intrusion is. So I call it like TrickBot in the cloud, right? So this is the Cloud Jumper MSP intrusion breach. It's in the news, but it's not widely covered yet. But because of the lasting consequences of this breach, we might see even more victims coming out of that, and as we see daily. So, for example, this is the statement made by one of the presidents of the company who said that, hey, we've been hit by Ryuk. They only saw Ryuk because the systems were infected with Ryuk, but we all know Ryuk is Trigbot Group. So, as I mentioned earlier, Ryuk is a ransomware. So they've been hit by Ryuk. They asked, like, all their customer base approximately. They claimed the breach was essentially a third-party connector. They connected to the Cloud Jumper network that was already infected, and once inside, infected some of the customer environments. So if you guys use Cloud Jumper, be aware, I guess that was going on. And they asked like over 600,000 of Bitcoins across all the whole customer base. Think about this Cloud Jumper breach as the breach into the master breach, the breach into the other environments. And this is kind of the statement they made. They identified it, and there's a lot of interesting things going on with that. Because Ryuk ransomware per se, it's one of the most potent and one of the most interesting ones because their encryption is not decryptable, and they've been actually quite professional in the way they do things. And this is kind of like the premise of the talk and everything else, why Active Directory matters and everything else. So once we get inside to MSP provider, we are pretty much doomed, right? Because we all use cloud service providers. So we outsource all of it in the US at the very least. We all rely on companies to manage our Active Directory. We expose our external infrastructure to some third parties. We kind of used to have a joke. I was also tracking some Mage card groups, the credit card scheming. So whenever you upload somebody else's like either JavaScript code or do something on your website that you don't know about, it's not your website anymore. It's not your infrastructure whenever you delegate it to some third parties. And this is kind of like the premise of this, as we lose control and delegations over our own resources. And it's, of course, the third-party risk. So this is kind of like how the things are unfolding currently. And just to give you an idea, if you guys, of course, familiar, it's more of a technical, I guess, medium difficulty talk. I want to make sure we cover some of the basics of Active Directory. So Active Directory, if you're doing pen tests or you're engage in some additional management of infrastructure, you realize that Active Directory, once you're inside domain controller, you got the keys to the kingdom. You get everything you need. So you can do both from the local privilege escalation, you can move across, you can identify scheduled tasks, which oftentimes contain hard-coded passwords, because that's how we do things. We humans, we simplify in many ways how we do routine tasks. So in Active Domain Controller, that's exactly how it works. So you essentially, it's a Windows instrumentation network, and I'll talk more deeper into in a second from a technical side, how they actually code this and how this Active Directory, ADSI, Windows API works. So, but this is kind of primarily the key there. And all the breaches we've seen linked to either Emotet, Trigbot, and sophisticated groups, the key thing was the Active Directory exploitation. So once they're in, they can do anything. And they can just push their additional malware on hosts, they can push ransomware, or they can pretty much, they're the full God mode, essentially. And that's also the other criminal groups realize that. And this is just a slide. I want to really go a little bit deeper into some technical analysis and just some of the code constructs as they use to code the same tools. And we'll just, we'll stay in that for a second. So this is kind of what's the techniques the Trigbot uses. So they wrote their own domain 32 DLL module. Actually, I wrote on my own blog back in 2017. We saw the precursors of that coming. And this is kind of the domain DLL modules. Essentially, it's the module meant to enumerate and essentially identify some of the most interesting assets from domain controller, so DC. So they identify for specific XML files, printers, users, schedule, jobs, and everything else. And essentially, if you guys are familiar with sysvol, so sysvol essentially, it's a shared folder and domain controller. So whenever you're doing pen tests and everything else, I highly recommend for you to look for Active Directory sysvol, because sysvol contains all the, not all of it, but if it's not properly secured, you can get domain pretty quickly at any company. So, and this is kind of by default some of the method of operations. And it's focused, this specific module, they drop on machines to look for Active Directory. They call it domain grabber, but a very specific Active Directory domain grabber. they have like both, like I mentioned on top. Actually, there's a hash. I'll upload the talk as well, so you can go back as well and research, because there's a lot of technical content here on top of this. This is kind of essentially how it works. So we have like a different, module with usual exports, ordinals, etc. And it starts, it makes an LDAP query via Windows API, and then it makes the, I call it LDAP WNet calls, where it starts enumerating, connecting to resources, and then tries to do like file finder functions, where it tries to identify and enumerate XML trees within the domains. So this is kind of like how it works. And a very of course, my presentation wouldn't be a presentation if I would not include IDA decompiled things, but this is the sysvol thing. So here you can see that they enumerate sysvol, so which is essentially they identify hosts, try to see if they can connect to this. What I mentioned earlier, sysvol is just a folder on domain controller, and seeing if it's accessible would enable them to be very successful. And they make connections, they try to connect, auto-connect, collect the data. And this is kind of like, this is again, them trying to identify those files of interest. And to even dive even deeper, what specific things you, like in every company in the world, does sophisticated Active Directory management, they always contain some of those files. For example, scheduled task XML, data sources, printers, there's also users and everything else. So scheduled tasks, whenever you manage infrastructure, oftentimes contains hard-coded passwords, credentials, you can name it. It's because the idea, we never thought that, well, we never thought that, but we never realized how actually lucrative for criminals to get inside and get those XML trees and parse it and use it for their own exploitations. Very clever. And I think they actually took this technique from one of the pen testing kind of articles before, written about how fruitful it is to exploit Active Directory in major corporations and governments. So this is that piece. Another module they use for identifying high-value targets is called network DLL. It's a DLL, dynamic link library file. So whenever you get infected with TrickBot, they would essentially download additional module. And the module is essentially the idea of that, just to query all the network information and identify, they run the ipconfig all, for example. They run the, actually, WQL queries, WMI, all of that stuff. Another thing is they try to establish trust, which is kind of interesting. I've never seen that before. Before they actually query the LDAP, Lightweight Directory Protocol, Active Directory, they try to establish trust between domains. So you can see NL test. So you want to see what the trust level between machines in the network, in the forest, and domains. And then once this information is collected, it will be sent over to them on their back end, and they can just search themselves. So, and I'll show you how it actually looks like from their side. And yeah. So that's primarily the module that was super active, super useful for them, identifies high-value targets very reliably and routinely. And this is primarily, I want to focus on the LDAP, Lightweight Directory Network and Domain Queries. So you can see there's an LDAP connection is being made here, essentially. It's an LDAP protocol where, in a way you communicate HTTP, but you can communicate via LDAP. And is essentially queries they make computers in forests, users in forests. And in a forest, essentially, it's a way for you to identify a domain part of the Active Directory. And this is kind of the terminology they use: domain, forest, and this is kind of all the information they collect. So you can see that's very extensive data about every single machine once they're inside. Before they deploy ransomware, before they stage into and prepare for additional exploitation phase, they already done lots of reconnaissance. I would call it more like reconnaissance modules, because they're not, they collect all the data, but they're not meant to be malicious on their own. And that's where kind of the key part, as I mentioned earlier, where we see automations of collections of all the data, forest trees, domain controller, names and users, IP addresses, but then also connecting with the sophisticated network breach actors who can go inside, deploy additional modules, and Ryuk ransomware, as you've seen with the Cloud Jumper case, which is still very alarming to us, as we see more and more breaches coming out as a result of that. Another interesting module I want to cover with you too. It's called essentially PSFin 32, which is it's kind of a point of sale finder reconnaissance module. So whenever this guy is inside, we also realized that approximately at the end of 2018, they deployed a module that also queries LDAP, also is meant for targeting essentially Active Directory and is meant to exploiting that, but also it doesn't steal anything. Actually, that's the key there. It's reconnaissance. So what they do, they parse for very specific machines of interest that either have point of sale targets, and I'll cover that in a second. And it's at that time, actually, this module was just in time for the US holiday season. Like as you know, Target, like which company in the US was breached before the holiday season where everybody goes shopping. We still have not identified what's the final point of sale malware or what do they do, but we know that they've been targeting point of sale retails and stores of interest whenever they're interested. It's kind of like one of the latest interests we've been seeing. In the US, it's also another thing for you to know that like in the US, not every business moved to the EMV, Europay, MasterCard, and Visa, and not every business relies on point-to-point encryption. So lots of businesses are affected by like groups like Fin7, Trigbot, Fin6, because of their abilities to scrape like card data from memory. It has been very successful. Everybody was doing it for years. But now, like in Europe, it's more complex because there's lots of more encryption. There's more card standards that inhibit that. But in the US, it's super, super relevant. And because not every business is, we call it PCI, Payment Card Industry compliant. If they are, it's going to be, well, instead of fully compliant with the point-to-point encryptions and EMV, they defeat all of that, primarily if it's point-of-sale malware is deployed, but if they're not, that's a problem. And this is kind of like the module meant to explore. This also references, all the presentation include references to additional like researches I did or some of the trusted researchers I work with. And this is just to give you an idea, like what's the common, like typical point of sale, retail network environments you usually encounter like from the attacker side. So you can see different like segregations, you can see different networks, you oftentimes see domain controller, you can see both card network environments, well, normally actually separated from additional environments. So you might see some sort of like a bridge between the two, and you need to find out how to communicate to that. So, and they also rely on Active Directory. And that's kind of the key there is because to manage like multi-tenancy retail point of sale terminals across the world with thousands of retail shops like Home Depot or Target in the US, it's very complex, but it requires lots of automation. And that's where the Active Directory comes in. And this is just to give you, again, another IDA Pro screenshot. And this is them querying for example, here. So they use again, open up a new object essentially in, so the Windows API kind of like DL library they use, it's called like ADSI, Active Directory Services Interface. So ADSI DLL contains lots of useful calls you can make to actually communicate via LDAP. So that's what Trigbot it does. So it obtains access to essentially to this LDAP query, category computer, and there's a very specific hard-coded things you can find on MSDN and just recode it yourself. And they can look in for example, micros. Micros POS is one of the most popular, of course, terminal vendor provided, and so they try to identify how it actually looks. Do they have like micros in the network? Do any domain controls or any machines within the domain resemble anything that looks like point-of-sale devices? But not only point-of-sale devices, they also care about specific models. And the reason why they care about specific models is because not every model you can dump memory. Like, for example, Verifone is not dumpable because it doesn't use the same technique. So you need somebody, you need to find essentially, you need to find a very specific machines that have that capabilities to dump the memory and search for card data. And this is kind of like how it, again, works. Again, a little bit more technical. So they actually use this kind of like the whole global catalog. It's another way to talk through LDAP and identify for OUs, sites, groups, computers, wild searches, and hunting through network environments for, like, for example, queries for POS. Of course, POS machines, I think registers, cashiers probably. A lane in the US too, like we call it, and some of the machines in our network environments we call lane because they are like, we have multi-layered tenancy, and lanes and cashiers pretty much the same. Store, retail, BOH, BCH, not sure about that one. Aloha is another very, very popular point of sale terminal. Micros POS and terminal as well. So again, this is primarily how it works, and on the very technical side. It's called PSFIN, essentially stands for Point of Sale Finder. So again, Active Directory enables to find that through global catalog. And this is just to give you an idea what's the kind of life cycle on some of the TTPs. Actually, I borrowed some of the one of the colleagues' work, well, screenshots, I guess rather. So Brett Duncan from Malware Traffic Analysis did really good stuff, a good job of identifying what's the follow-up and how the infections work. For example, you can see here, like, as I mentioned earlier, Emotet usually installs now TrickBot, most popular, most sophisticated, kind of like most reliable loader. So after TrickBot has been installed, you can see there's some traffic going on, and approximately 3 hours, you saw also that PowerShell Empire. And that's kind of like one of the key things there, that the actors, once they identify machines or they think they want to piggyback on additional environment and poke around and kind of like use the interactive exploitation, they would use some PowerShell Empire. And this is kind of like if you work to play with PowerShell Empire, highly recommend it. It's still kind of relevant even in the age of reduced PowerShell privileges, still really relevant. And you can see that's a typical HTTP post request on port 443 HTTP SSL, where you would identify that essentially it's a default path. So they get inside and ask the bot to execute and download and install PowerShell Empire. And that's kind of like the trick there was. They sit quietly until they're interested in you. And that's how the traffic looks like from at least from their side whenever you get infected. And you can be infected in a variety of ways, usually through Microsoft Word, malicious macro, PowerShell installs, and TrickBot, actually Emotet, TrickBot, and then PowerShell Empire, and then Ryuk ransomware whenever they're interested. And this is kind of like how the data looks like. This is actually from the active case of Ryuk ransomware, when essentially, whenever they got inside Ryuk, they run all the scripts I showed you earlier, network domains and Active Directory parsing. They pull all the records. I have obfuscated, of course, the victim entity here. But once this data has been collected, domains, they look for list of domains in the local domain. And that's how they identify high-value targets. So they saw there's a big company that got inside. They ran this DLL modules. You got in. Then they piggybacked through PowerShell Empire, stayed a little bit quieter, tried to dump everything they had in the network environment, essentially from car data to sensitive financial documents, and then they deployed Ryuk, but only in the end as one of the most profitable ventures for them. And actually, to even give you an idea, in most of the cases where I've seen, I would say 80% of the cases, Ryuk people and companies usually pay criminals, because there's no way for you to again decrypt the data. I know there's a law enforcement advice where we say you never pay extortionists. But in many cases, when they also hit lots of companies with high availability needs, for example, hospital networks or additional vital environments. So they need availability now, not tomorrow. So they usually actually comply with the actors and pay. And Ryuk asks between $50,000 in bitcoins, and they would provide a decryptor to I mentioned earlier, like the $5 billion US they ask once they've been inside essentially the cloud jumper network, and they still do that actually because of it's kind of TrickBot in the cloud. And this is kind of like whenever you got kind of like really affected, and this is kind of the last resort. So whenever the victims see just Ryuk, remember it's never just Ryuk. The only reason why they see Ryuk because probably all the systems either been destroyed, all the logs been cleared, and there's nothing else to left behind. As they say, no system is safe, and they sign Ryuk. One of the interesting things that I like about their email, actually note, they also add at the end, to confirm our honest intentions, we'll provide you a free file decryptor. It's very smart actually. And if you ever see this in your network environment and you can see per ton mail or 2-ton node emails to communicate, that means it's probably Ryuk. And usually the way it works, there's no backend server. You just have to email the actors directly and negotiate. And they're actually very responsible. They actually reply to you very quickly. They're very engaged. They want to work with you. Some actually, I've seen like 3 types of Ryuk actors. Ones that really want to kind of like negotiate with you, willing to negotiate. There's another group they work with who are like very strict about their requests. So they would ask like for ridiculous money and just like say, nope, we just want like 500K in Bitcoins tomorrow. And there's another group that just actually, another group that has different TTPs, but they're also kind of willing to negotiate as well. And so there are 3 groups of people you can talk over those emails. One is good, one is bad, and one is also kind of okay. I'm saying good, I mean in a way that they cooperate and be more reasonable, because it's really hard to get 500,000 Bitcoins in one day. So I want to also cover some of the mitigation techniques, detections, and what we've been covering and talking about what some of the most relevant cases we've seen, what's the Active Directory, and how successful it is for Trigbot, Ryuk, Emotet. So whenever you go back to your network environment, ask like who has active domain rights to forests, domains, everything else. Ask those people like, are you in charge of that thing that we use in our organization? Yes, you are. Okay. Identify who else can log into the same network environments and use the same information, because that's how Trigbot was doing too. And identify that. And then there's another thing that I mentioned earlier. Domain DLL has XML parser for files like scheduled tasks and with passwords. Ask for them, and actually there's another idea I took from, credited to Sean Metcalf from AD Security. So he also said that you can place a new XML file into this sysvol directory, which sysvol I mentioned earlier, it's one of the most config folders within your Active Directory, and set everyone deny. Because nobody needs to read what's in your data in your active domain. There's no need for any employee or anyone else unless it's maybe one admin needs to do that. And plus there should be like lots of audits. One of the key things you've seen, whenever you track, like if Trigbot got inside your Active Directory, you can audit for access denied errors for those specific files. Once you have the XML files. And another thing is, I mentioned earlier that Trigbot searches for specific point of sale terminals, OUs, admins and location, GPOs, global policies, and look for permissions. Let's see if you can grab whatever they can grab and see how successful they can be. But in general, like have a good interview with the person or in charge of the program and ask them, hey, do you know who runs our Active Directory? Can you just tell them to either reduce privileges or mitigate that? Other things you can also see for account and group enumeration. There's specific event ID logs you can look for, Windows logs, just to see if there's anything related to that. And usually those are going to be very high fidelity alerts, because nobody needs to read into that unless it's domain and somebody tries to complete your network environment. So and there's some credits also kind of linked into the GitHub page as well from Ramat Nufazi and Sean, who actually have excellent advices on what else you can do from the enterprise side or from bank side or anyone else who manages like Active Directory. And also whenever you delegate this management to additional third party, ask them the same exact questions. Because whenever you do that, remember it's not your network anymore, but you're still going to be responsible for all the losses stemming from this and reputational damage and of course, and other things. So keep that in mind. So some of the key takeaways I want you to walk away with. The current sophisticated e-crime landscape is becoming more sophisticated, but also becoming more interactive. In a way that it's a combination of both automation, where they have malware that deploys and collects everything. Imagine Emotet. So the scale and volume of the operation is ridiculous, and they deploy everything in Trigbot too. So, and they collect so much data. And now they've seen that to really monetize their data, it's not enough to do fully automation. And it's not enough to squeeze all the value from their bots. You need to essentially have a human network exploitation expert to get inside the network environment and install additional tools, find the Active Directory, look for, install ransomware, for example, because it enables them to be even more successful. And the way to identify, I've been asked quite a bit, how does Trigbot identifies what's a target of interest for them from the financial side, or is it useless, or it's just something of interest? Two things, Active Directory and network enumeration. Two specific modules, actually there's three I covered earlier, but three things that enable them to identify what are the most protected and most sensitive data sets they can get inside. Identify is it worth for them to go deeper into or is it just going to be a waste of time? Is it a researcher machine I'm just infecting and just wasting my time, or it's a high value target? So, and they don't want to waste their time, trust me, because they have huge bills on their server infrastructure and they need cash, preferably in Russian rubles, but if it's not attainable, Bitcoins. So another thing we've seen is the cloud MSPs, the cloud managed service providers are kind of the desired target, because they're gateways to other corporate environments. Whenever we think about the attackers, the way they see the world, they also see victims as potential gateways to additional networks. That's where the use case of Cloud Jumper. And this is actually the actual Cloud Jumper from, I think it's kind of the dragon, how to train your dragon, the cartoon. And I think that's where they got into that, Cloud Jumper. Not to mistake with Cloud Hopper, because that's a whole Chinese APT group that I'm not covering that. So in this note also I want to just provide a few special credits with the researchers who I work a lot with, Joshua Platt and Jason Reeves, who collaborate in a few points. And at this time I want to thank you for attending, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or elsewhere. And thank you for organizers. And I'll take a pause and take a few questions if you guys may have. Thank you.